what does this have to do, this educational video have to do with you? It's because you have the ability to do something that all these teachers do in small pieces. You have the ability to reach a huge audience and communicate. And that's what you are. Bottom line, you're communicators. And I think, for my part, what I'm doing here is wanting you to understand the implications of that communication. And this video shows it in spades. God bless this faculty or alumni member, the older gentleman, who had the cojones to let them videotape this and then release it. That guy, that's the kind of courage we need. One of the things I find at this level often, at the university level, with my students is that a couple of things have happened. One, everyone is afraid to make a mistake. And when I ask for responses from my students, I get nothing. They sit there and look at me like this. There are a few brave individuals who will raise their hands, but for the most part, they're afraid. This has become a real problem. Science is making errors. We do it all the time. Have I made any mistakes today? Well, I'm none that I'm probably going to disclose to you, but yes, I have. It happens all the time. And part of this misconception business is the mindset that you don't want to get out of it. The other thing that I think is truly vital in this video is the power of misconceptions. We do not want to give those up. Look, and direct instruction. She was getting all this lovely direct instruction, plus a little bit of modeling. It was still difficult for her to give that up. When I first addressed this kind of thing with my students, when I'm teaching the seminar classes, the science seminar classes, I have students who just can't believe what I'm trying to convey to them. But I know for a fact that just saying this is the right answer doesn't make them believe it.
Said something about how fast a tennis ball, somebody had a serve that was X miles an hour. And I said, yeah, what's really impressive is that the tennis ball accelerated from 0 to that speed in just the amount of time that the racket is touching the ball. And then it's slowing down after that. And they were like, no, intuitively to them, it's like it probably takes a little while to get up to speed. And I was like, no, this is a fact. And you can say this is a fact. The only thing giving it the speed is the racket. It slows down after that. And they wanted to hang on to that.
Because they've seen rockets go faster.
Right, yeah.
Right, yeah. With more acceleration.
Like 0 to 60.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, this is great. I love the discussion we have with this because it should generate discussion. I mean, it generates discussion for me as an educator because I have to, every year, I want to change what I'm doing to make sure I try to avoid this. And the first thing I want to do is address any misconceptions or preconceptions that my students have when they come in. That's difficult. Now, you have a broader range when you are writers and what you're doing. And maybe that makes it even more incumbent upon you to make sure that things are accurate. I think back about early science fiction that I read, and I know that some of them I read, like Journey to the Mushroom Planet, probably was more fantasy and not much accuracy, but I realized that a lot of the, and again, Asimov was one of the early, and Arthur C. Clarke, some of the early stuff I read, I realized that the science was good. It made sense to me. It was good. But you think about what people have, lay people, everyday experience, and it goes back to what Mike's mom said. Well, if you're closer to the top of the stove where the burner is, it's warmer, isn't it? Those are some of the very early experiences that kids have. And they tend to want to cling to those things. They can only explain, people can only explain phenomena. They can only explain things in terms of their own experience. And what we as educators know is that simply telling them that they're wrong, and we have all been hearing some great examples of that, simply telling them they're wrong does not dissuade them from their misconceptions. So you really have to do something that's dramatic. One of my colleagues here at the university, Dr. Joseph Steppens, who's now a professor emeritus, Joe worked a lot with misconceptions, and I worked with him for years. And we find that that's what you have to have. What you have to have is what's called a conceptual change. You actually have to address that. And who knows, in your writing one of these days, you may have an opportunity to spend 2 or 3 paragraphs just to be able to address that, so that you don't let your vocabulary or something you've said or something that someone else has brought into it lead to misconceptions. It goes back to the terminology of direct and indirect when we're talking about the sun's rays. That's very easy, very common vocabulary, something that's used a lot in astronomy when you're talking about that. But is it really the best descriptor for what happens? We're not sure, and we see that probably there could be another avenue for explaining that so that people would genuinely understand it and it would still make sense to them, even in spite of a preconception or a misconception.
You know, we also have these ridiculous terms. We were talking about new moon and full moon, which aren't really intuitively obvious what
No.
they mean. And the quarter moon, the first quarter and the second quarter, look like half circles instead of quarter circles.
That's right.
It's confusing. My latest novel has a blind main character, and I was researching misconceptions that blind people have about the physical world. And a reasonably common one amongst people who've always been blind is that the quarter moon looks like a quarter of a circle, you know, like,
Right.
Like that. Not anything at all like what it looks like. Because
Exactly.
they've never had to touch anything that explains it. They know what a... So we have this ridiculous vocabulary we use about the moon too that just exacerbates this problem.
Right. It's a very common mistake. Now, when you're talking about phases of the moon and the seasons, and these are two things, when I talk to my students, I'll often say, you should understand the seasons. 4,000 years ago, you understood the seasons, or you starved. You had to know this stuff. And now you're spending most of your time inside. You're sitting on your butt, you're using your iPod, you're using the computer, you're using all this other stuff, and there has become a disconnect to the natural world. And we see that in science all the time. And there are a lot of science initiatives right now trying to get kids back to reconnect with the natural world. Because you would pay attention. It's like me getting up every morning and taking my coffee to my wife, and having my cup of coffee, looking out to the east, and actually seeing where that sun's coming up and seeing those changes. You pay attention. It takes patience, you have to do it. And we live in a world now where sound bites are brief. You know, CNN and MSNBC have got 4 things running at the same time there. And it's hard to get to the meat of trying to address these misconceptions, these preconceptions, and get past it. And I sometimes feel like I'm asking a lot of you when I want you to consider this kind of thing in your writing. But I think that it's an invigorating thing to be able to know that you might be reaching thousands, hundreds of thousands, who knows how many readers, and having a really significant impact on the way they look at the world and the way they look at science. Not just as literature, but as separate entities too.
That's also a really intimidating thing, though, because to know, you know, it's no pressure to suddenly realize that if you get the science wrong in your hard science fiction story, that you could be corrupting the minds of millions of children, or, you know, something.
Well, I don't want you to think about corrupting the minds of the, you know, we've got other people on the planet to do that. But certainly I understand that there is a responsibility. I mean, that's why I never teach the same way twice. I don't teach the same way every semester, because every semester I see things that I did that weren't the way they should have been. The seasons are something that you would think would be relatively intuitive if you're outside paying attention at all. But obviously, and some of you, based on the way you were able to answer this pretest we gave out, there's still some potential for confusion about it. Now, we know that what causes it, and we can certainly say it, but we do have to, and your book, the Horizons book, when I first started teaching over here with the year that Mike came, well, it was the year Mike came, the first Seeds edition had only an explanation of phases of the moon and seasons with these exaggerated orbital ellipses, because frankly, let's talk about it. It's a lot more dramatic to see it on edge so that you've got this more dramatic view than just having a circle and another circle inside it. And that's part of what they were doing. About my 4th year in the department, Seeds changed that, and they actually had 2 sets of diagrams showing the way things change in an effort to try to address that very thing about the graphical representation was creating misconceptions. And you need to do that. So I applaud them for trying to work at it, but it's very difficult. For one thing, you're looking at a 2-dimensional page and you're trying to represent a 3-dimensional model, and that makes it difficult. So if we're talking about the seasons, we want that to be something that you should be able to pay attention to. I mean, most of my students have been on the planet long enough that if they had just paid attention for that 18, 19, or 20 years, they would have had a pretty good feel for it. But a lot of them don't pay attention. It's not uncommon for me to have students who don't realize that you can see the moon during daylight hours. I've said, well, how many of you, did you see the moon out there today? Well, what are you talking about? Well, it's up there, yeah, you can see that. And so it's a real confusion, and you have to try to address that kind of thing. The phases of the moon, I think, is a little more complex problem. Because most students, when we finally get past this business, for instance, if the sun is in Gemini when it rises, it's in Gemini all the way across the sky because the Earth is turning on its axis, and that's what's creating night and day. It isn't because the sun is whipping around us that fast, as if the very ancient models talked about. So you can kind of get a feel for that. But when you introduce the phases of the moon, you're introducing another set of dynamics. You've got the sun out there, we're orbiting the sun, and then the moon is orbiting the Earth, and it's not orbiting at the same pace. How many days does it take for the moon to go around the Earth? 20 and a half. We're talking, but it's not uncommon for people to not quite understand that, and it's that dynamic you have to introduce into that discussion in order for people to try to really understand what it's all about when it comes to misconceptions about the phases of the moon. And this business about, well, something's blocking the light is common because when we see a shadow and then we see an illuminated body and we do that, that makes a difference in what we see, doesn't it? They bring in limited experience. And it's not uncommon that people who are out there, now we're hoping that most people who want to read your books, your stories, what you're putting out there, are interested in a great story, but interested in the science too. So that your advantage is that they're interested in learning for the most part. So you have those different dynamics in terms of that. And we don't just have misconceptions in terms of astronomy. And here's an example. And there's a gentleman, Jonathan Drury, who is a prominent British educator. And he gives 3 examples in a discussion that he has. And he says, okay, you have the seed for a tree. It's about this big, very small. And here's some of that wood out of that tree. Where does the stuff come from that made this wood? Where's the stuff come from that makes that? The ground and water and water. And those are common answers. Almost all of it is from the carbon dioxide. It's carbon. It's the air. That's where it comes from. The process is photosynthesis, but the material is air. Now, why don't people believe that? Well, am I lifting anything up here? Can I feel? No. We live in an ocean of air, so it's very easy for us to not think about it. It's not intuitive, probably, to think about the fact that it has mass. I'll have my students get up and say, okay, start doing this. You feel anything against your hand? Yep. So does air have mass? Is there something there? Yeah, there really is. But it's hard for them to get past that concept to understand that the real core building stuff that makes this wood is the air. Because does it take a lot of it? Yeah, but those plants are working at making a lot of it in there every day, so it works. So misconceptions are around us all the time, and I guess I'm wanting you to think about that in terms of your audience, of what you're wanting to think about doing. And again, I'll be happy to have myself available too if you have questions about things like that. If you're getting in writing the same way Mike has been just tremendous resource for all the folks in the previous workshops. Yeah.
I know I used to know this, but so why isn't every full moon a lunar eclipse? Where's the shadow of the Earth during most full moons?
Well, that's orbital dynamics. It has to be lined up just right to be able to make it an eclipse.
What is it?
Because
There's
a 5-degree tilt between the plane of the
orbit
of the Earth around the sun and the moon around the Earth. So you
Yeah.
have to have
perfect
you have
alignment.
to have those two planes intersect at the same time you have
Right.
the new moon.
Okay, now explain that without using your hands.
And this is important because I think Jim's going to talk about this a bit later.
Yeah.
People learn things in different ways. Some people can see something and learn it. Some people hear something and learn it. Other people need to watch.
They've got to have it.
The
Yeah.
phases of the moon, it seems like you can see it on paper, but either on paper or a model seems almost essential to.
I think the easiest way is to go out when the moon and sun are both up and say, okay, the sun is way farther away than the moon. Now think about why that part of the moon is illuminated.
Right.
And if you look at it in the sky, you know the sun's 400 times farther away than the moon is. And you go, oh yeah, okay, I can see it. But when you try and do it with these models and looking down at it,
Especially when they're
stand on the Earth and look, and you
Yep.
can see that light there will only illuminate that portion of the sphere as seen from here. Makes perfect
But you
sense
know, you
out
can-
in the field.
You can show this to a kid and they'll get it immediately if you say, okay, you're going to be the Earth. Okay, you give them, and you have one light on in the room.
Yes, yes.
You give them a tennis ball and say, can you imagine if that looks like a quarter moon? Now start moving towards the light, and you see the phase changing.
Right.
As you move toward the light.
Yeah, this is
They'll
this
go,
is
"Oh,
this
yeah,
This was
Yeah,
how
yeah.
they taught us
Yeah.
in school.
And-
you
and-
know, and I mean, the dumbest kid in our class could tell you the phases of the moon.
Because you've got it right there.
That tool that they have there with
Oh, the Ori? Yeah, that's right. But Mike and I used that when I was teaching the labs for Introductory Astronomy 1050. We always did that one because we had students who actually, immediately in the first week of class, or it's going to be a long semester, because doing that, and I would get somebody, some brave soul to come up and actually do it, and then you could almost see the lights going on in the eyes around the room because it started making sense. And Mike's right, and we'll have a quick break here in a minute, but in education we know there are a lot of different ways. Howard Gardner is a great educator, and he talks about all the intelligences and how important they are in the way we learn. And there are a lot of different ways, and we aren't just singular learners, we aren't just visual learners or auditory learners or proprioceptive learners. We have all of those, but we have strengths and weaknesses, and you've got to be able to try to address that. Now, how you're going to do that, and no, I'm not sure, but I have faith that you're going to find a way to do that because we all have different learning styles. But I know people, my brother was a great example, bless his heart. He grew up, and because we lived in Midwest Wyoming, we had to drive to Casper, the big city, which was 25,000 people, once a month to buy groceries. And because I was the oldest child, my mother would buy us comic books because she didn't want us tagging around in the store. We were nothing but a pain in the butt. And she would give us the comic books, and I would read to my little brother. I would read Batman and Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge and Red Ryder and all that good stuff. And he claimed later on in life, and I suspect it was true, is that he only became a reader in his 30s because he didn't have to do it. He had somebody else doing that for him. So he became a learner in many different ways. He was really a kinesthetic learner as he grew up, you know. He wanted his hands-on stuff. He wanted to smell it and sniff it and put his hands in it, and he learned like that. And he taught me that because I was primarily, you know, left-brained. I'll go ahead and read it, and then I'll incorporate it and get it done. And thank God he drug me out into the oil patch with him for a couple of years, and I learned to be a different kind of learner because you can't just be intellectual when you're out there and everything outweighs you on the rig. You have to learn to be appropriate, receptive, kinesthetic learner. And I'll leave you with this before we take a little break and we move on. Having worked in the oil field for a couple of years, the first thing I noticed about Armageddon, the big mistake, is there was nobody that I ever worked on a rig that I would trust to send in space and save the planet. I mean, it wasn't uncommon for one of the 5 of us, not the driller, because he had to remain relatively sane. And I'm not saying there aren't smart, good people out there. There were some brilliantly self-educated people out there, but we'd always have 1 or 2 who'd showed up either stoned or drunk when we were coming in and out of the hole, and they weren't the folks that I would be sending out there to take care of saving the planet. I'll leave it at that. Let's take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll get into this business a little bit more. Okay?